Hi again, Professor Sackett-Taylor here, picking up where we left off with chapter 11 slash chapter 12. And where we just were, we were looking at how we measure economic wealth or economic growth and why it matters. And we looked at the global context of how growth has been experienced and sustained across the globe in both wealthy nations and poor nations. And so where I'm picking up in this part of the lecture is on those three causes of economic growth. We're really going to break down where economic growth comes from. So economic growth is really important, as we've seen. And there are three primary sources of economic growth: resources, technology, and the role of institutions. When we talk about resources, we're thinking about all of the inputs that are used to produce goods and services. They're the factors that generate wealth through production. And they're certainly important, but they're not the only thing that matters. When we think of resources, we want to think not only of production resources that are in the form of natural or human capital, but also physical capital. So each of these factors is going to be broken down in the upcoming slides. These are going to be all considered categories that are factors of production. So again, we're looking at natural, human, and physical capital. Natural capital or natural resources are anything that comes from the earth, the physical land and the inputs that naturally occur in or on the land. So this includes things like coal, oil, lumber, water, paper, paper meaning it comes from, trees, fish, other forms of wildlife, anything, minerals, heavy metals, things that we extract from the earth and environmental systems. So we know that natural resources and their availability to us as an input for production can be affected by weather, disease, drought, and also trade disparities. So land is not in and of itself enough for economic growth. We have to think about all the ways in which we use the environment, both as a source of inputs and as a sink for the waste that's a byproduct of our production processes. Human capital is the resource that's represented by knowledge and skills provided by the workers in the economy. So while more people might lead to an increase in production, it doesn't always make GDP per capita higher, since the population is also bigger, right? Because then we're dividing GDP by a larger number as well. So it is possible to expand the productive capabilities of human capital by simply increasing the number of workers, but it's also by doing things like enhancing the skills and education of the existing labor force. Education itself is not enough. For example, for many years, India struggled with economic growth, even though they had a really high literacy rate overall, a highly educated population. So there are a number of factors that work together here. Physical capital is probably the thing that we think of most often. These are like the tools, the man-made things, tools, equipment, factories that are used towards the production of goods and services. So the purpose of capital is to, invest in better technologies now in order to enable us to produce more in the future. So as the quantity of physical capital rises per worker, so does the output per worker, usually. So those are resources. We had natural, human, and physical capital resources. The second source of economic growth is technology. Technological advances are the basis for the knowledge or the processes that we use in production. So new technology usually enables us to produce more while using fewer inputs, right? More output, less input. That's usually what we mean by a technological advance. So technological advancement, as defined by economists, is where we introduce new techniques or methods so the firm can produce more valuable output for every unit of input that they are using. So we, for example, have seen a series of technological advances in the agricultural sector. For example, here, US farmers can now produce more milk, more soy, more corn than they ever have before. Again, there are pros and cons to these things. We can't always think that growth is only positive. There are always, unintended consequences of growth. For example, in the dairy industry, although we are much more productive and we can produce much more milk using fewer cows, the way that it's done is that those cows are kept in a milking parlor for, 20 out of 24 hours a day and given very little access to pasture. To grass anymore. They're usually fed in the barn with baled hay, and they're connected to milking machinery for most of the day. And so while we've become more productive, some might argue, right, that there are animal welfare things that are happening that is kind of the cost of that productivity. So technology is only one piece of the puzzle. Technology, some people think that technology will save us. I think that technology will help us, but economic growth only happens when the resources and the technology work together. So, innovations don't tend to occur randomly. There tend to be little hotspots of innovation, places where, there are large clusters of entrepreneurs and innovators and technology. I'm thinking like MIT and Silicon Valley, right? So although technological innovation tends to breed more innovation, it's distributed in an unequal way geographically. And so it's this helps us kind of understand, why do some regions innovate and therefore grow faster than others? Well, part of that is going to be, tied into the role of institutions, which is where I'm going next. So when I use the word institutions, I'm specifically talking about organizations, but also not a physical organization. Westfield State University is an institution. Noble Hospital is an institution, but it's larger systems and practices than that, right? We have, the institution of the way that we incarcerate people in our country. We have the global, food supply chain, which could arguably be an institution, and that there's a certain hierarchy of practices. It's the relationships between firms and individuals. And so institutions are not always tangible or physical items. They can be official or unofficial conditions that kind of shape the environment in which decisions are made. So the US Constitution or the Federal Reserve Bank is an institution because it's the essence that comprises kind of the habitual practices of how those things work. The rules and the mindset of the Federal Reserve Bank is what's important, not the building and the tables and the chairs, right? It's the ideas, the conditions within which decisions are made. That's what we mean by an institution, how things are done. So institutions will include laws, regulations, policies, government entities, but they also include things just like our work habits, our expectations, our political behaviors. It's how we conform to behave in a society. So some of the most important institutions that really shape an economy and our ability to grow are first our political stability and the presence of the rule of law, the presence of private property rights, and not only the presence of them, but the monitoring and enforcement of private property rights, having a stable monetary currency and stable prices over time, allowing markets to be open and relatively competitive, and having an efficient tax system. So I'm going to break some of these down into more detail. Let's start with private property rights. Private property rights are probably what I would say is the most important institution for fostering economic growth, because this is the institution that gives the right to individuals to own something and to use it for productive capability. And so it creates incentives, right? And we know that people respond to incentives. That was one of the Chapter 1 foundations. This is where the incentive comes from for people to innovate and for people to expand and produce more, right? It's the perhaps solely the greatest incentive for voluntary contributions to society. So like if workers and producers couldn't own any share of what they produce, they would have no incentive to produce it, right? So having a system of private property rights that is monitored and enforced, which is the important piece here, which is why we need institutions, because this is difficult to enforce on our own, is really central to this idea of growth. So political stability and the rule of law, we need, like speaking of private property rights and some, we need consistent and trustworthy enforcement of the laws that we've agreed to live by as a society, right? So like we need to know that if we stage elections, that the results of those elections will be upheld. For example, in the period of the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s in Liberia, they staged elections and then had rebel takeovers, violent upheavals, lots of violence between the government and the citizens of the country. And although other countries came to the aid of the people of Liberia in the amount of almost $4 billion in international aid, it was meant for that money to go towards industry and medical infrastructure, but most of the aid was seized by the people in power. And we talked about in an earlier lecture how not well Liberia is doing right now, right? So, like nothing was done with that aid to eliminate the instability. And therefore, there was no environment that was fostering any kind of economic growth. If the environment is one of political instability, there's no incentive to invest in your own education, in your own, skills and tools. There's no incentive to invest in physical capital if it can be violently taken from you, because there's no predictability in being able to have ownership over the future payoffs from those things. So it kind of stalls all economic productivity and economic growth. The World Justice Project, which is a really cool thing, you should look it up, shows how these high income nations are also nations that most closely adhere to what we refer to as the rule of law, which is, so basically like it's positively correlated with levels of income. So like countries that are of upper middle or high income groups also tend to have a very high rule of law index. So like better enforcement, better communication of laws, rules, and policies. And so it's, while correlation is not causation, correlation is an important, thing to look at here. So competitive and open markets, there are basically three market institutions essential for economic growth. We want competitive markets, which means that there are lots of buyers and lots of sellers, and that no individual firm holds market power over setting prices. What this ensures is that consumers are going to be able to buy things at moderately low prices and promote innovation by trying, by firms being incentivized to try to produce things at lower costs. International trade. We cannot do this alone. If you look at the countries that do not trade with others, countries that are pretty insular and have a very closed economy, they are very poor countries. So, they're not reaping the benefits that we talked about in chapter 2 of specialization and the gains that we get from specializing and comparative advantage, where we can consume outside of our own PPF. Countries that don't trade, they can never consume outside of their PPF, right? They're only consuming what they produce. And so they're not able to capture all these additional benefits that come with international trade. And finally, you have to allow funds to flow freely across borders. This helps firms invest in future production, not only in their own country, but in other countries. So we're such a globalized economy now that if we allow goods to cross borders, we also have to easily allow funds to cross borders. Finally, efficient taxes. So we've talked about in previous chapters now how taxes actually do create a deadweight loss to the economy. It's really a cost benefit analysis or a benefit, we're looking at how much we're able to raise in revenues comparing that against the deadweight loss in the reduced number of transactions that happen, right? So there's always there's something that we gain, there's something that we give up. So, the government is providing services and infrastructure through the revenue that comes from taxes. And, we have to be careful, because if we tax activities that are really fundamental to economic growth, then economic theory will predict that we'll see less of those activities, right? When you make something more expensive to do, people do less of it. And so in particular, if there are income producing activities that are taxed, it reduces the incentive for earning that income. So, output and income are inextricably linked when we're in a market economy. And so if we tax income, we're essentially taxing output, which is GDP. So we just have to be really careful about the level of those taxes and how much we're impeding the production and consumption decisions that go along with those transactions when a tax is present. They have to be high enough to support government, providing public services, but low enough not to reduce the incentive to produce. Stable money and prices. We need to know that our currency is going to be worth something in the future, right? We don't want to see hyperinflation or hyperdeflation, instability in the value of our money, right? We want to know that our spending power is going to be maintained, because otherwise there's very little incentive to earn money today to spend it tomorrow if the money I earn today is going to be worth less tomorrow. So we really need to shape the whole economy to keep inflation rates low, and interest rates should be incentivizing savings, because as we saw in the last chapter, when people save, what we're really doing is we're supplying money for loans, and loans are how people invest in capital. So it's like the loanable funds market that we need to promote in order to see those resources be used for their productive capability in the future. In the United States, it's the Federal Reserve Bank that's charged with administering monetary policy, and part of that monetary policy is trying to keep inflation stable. And so that's where we're going to go in future chapters. We're going to talk about fiscal policy and monetary policy. And so this is really setting us up for why those things are important. Okay, so practicing what we know: land, which is all forms of natural capital, labor, which is all forms of human capital, and capital, which is really physical capital. So really land, labor, capital, we should say natural resources, human capital, physical capital, are all forms of resources, inputs to the production process. Why is technological advancement important for economic growth? Well, it allows us to produce more output using fewer resources, or using less input. So if we can use less capital, less labor, less land, growth and quality of life will improve. And in addition, we can imagine that those inputs can go on to produce other goods that we've never produced before, because fewer goods were needed as inputs in the first place, right? So really technological advancement, technology with efficient resource use is where we see economic growth really take off. All right, that's where I leave you here. So first lecture, we talked about how we measure wealth and economic growth and why it's important. Second lecture, we just covered the three main components or the three main drivers of economic growth. Where does growth come from? In the third installment of this lecture, which is coming up next, so hold on to your hats, we're going to talk about growth theory and how growth theory has actually changed and evolved over time as we see the real world conditions and start to alter our models to be more realistic of what we see happening in the world. This is where we're going to start talking about that income inequality piece that I mentioned in the first video. So hold on tight and we'll get there. I know this is a long one, so take a break if you need it, but I'll see you just in a little bit for the third installment on chapter 11-12 on economic growth and growth theory.